Cashman is the leader of the Liberal Democrats in Liverpool. He does what Sir Ed Davey hopes to do nationally, be the official opposition to Labour. Today, Carl and I talk about why growing up on a council estate led him to the LibDems rather than Labour, what actually separates the two parties ideologically, if the LibDems should move more to the centre-right in order to win over people disillusioned with the Conservative Party, as well as what he thinks the coalition government got right. Carl and I have known each other for a long time. We actually recorded an interview back in August, but the audio was so bad that it was unusable. So we met in person last Friday and did what I feel is a better, funnier conversation. I hope you enjoy it.
Nice to see you again, Aaron.
After our last failed attempt. I'm going to start with my Inside the Actors Studio questionnaire. What's your favourite word?
I forgot that this was going to be asked from last time, actually. I like something like maybe discombobulated.
Nice. What is your least favourite word?
Can't.
What is a sound or noise that you love?
I think last time we spoke, my first reaction to that was I don't know what to say without sounding quite rude, but sound or noise that I love. Maybe like my dog barking when I've come home and he's happy to see me.
What is a sound or noise that you hate?
So I don't really like negativity. I'm quite a positive person, so when I hear kind of like groans, or I think that's why my least favourite word is can't, because I don't really like a negative approach to life. I like to be quite positive, even in the face of adversity sometimes.
What is your favourite book?
That's a tough one. I can't like The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. I don't know whether you've read that one. That's a good one. Like I've read Tony Blair's autobiography. The one that you recommended to me, I haven't quite made me way through that, but that's good. The Unfinished Revolution.
Yeah, that's a really good book. I listened to the audio of Tony Blair's autobiography, which was quite good. It was listening to the master speak.
Yeah. I got Tony Blair's more recent book on leadership, and I just there was little bits in there that I liked, but I felt in the main it was a love letter to Keir Starmer. it was I don't know, there were certain things there where I thought you're not going to understand what this means unless you're actually in a position of becoming a prime minister or minister of state.
I mean, literally today I started browsing Jonathan Powell, who's his chief of staff, who's now just been appointed Keir Starmer's national security advisor. He wrote a book called The New Machiavelli, and basically it's about how you govern in like a modern setting. And it seems much better written than Tony Blair's recent one.
Maybe not the master then.
Not the master pro stylist. Is there a fictional character who you imagine yourself to be?
Fictional character that I imagine myself to be. I mean, I quite like Deadpool, but I don't know whether I would compare myself to him or whether I would be able to survive in politics if I was anything like him. So
at the LibDem conference, you gave a speech about growing up in poverty. And so, something I was sort of curious about is you and I are from like similar parts of Merseyside, and the general assumption is that if you're from that kind of background, you would join the Labour Party, whereas we both seem to have gone on like different ideological journeys, like initially. So I was curious about that background, and then what about that led you to like the Lib Dems?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, I always kind of, I always say that to people who speak to me about getting involved in politics, that there is an assumption that when you come from that type of background, like a council estate, that you would get involved in the Labour Party. But I see it like a really different way, actually. And when I got involved in politics, it was kind of slightly by chance during the 2010 general election. And I just remember watching the election debates and thinking, God, this guy's speaking to me. Went away and read the manifesto, and I thought, this is fantastic. I'm a Liberal and I'm a Lib Dem, quite happy about it. And the way that I see liberalism is unlocking people's potential. And I think there's this kind of like neurosis in the Labour Party where like they're quite comfortable keeping people from those backgrounds where they are, because if they're kept in that position, then they tend to keep going out and voting for them. Whereas as a Liberal, I see like giving people the opportunity to realise their dreams as the ultimate objective in life. And I think people such as myself who are in that background, if you give them the education, if you give them tools, and if you give them the possibilities, they'll rise out of any poverty, or they'll go and, realise the dream of owning a home or owning a business. And I just don't think the Labour Party adopts that same philosophy. And I think it's even more neurotic when you explore the deeper left. So something like the Jeremy Corbyn types. It's kind of like this battle between poor and rich, and actually there's no idea of how to make the poor less poor.
What would you say to a Labour person saying that Labour's policies to alleviate, say, poverty or improve in education or anything like that? What would your counter be?
In terms of what Labour governments have done, or
I guess if a Labour person said, well, actually, Labour's done X, Y, and Z on improving the circumstances of people in those backgrounds, like what would your counter be?
I mean, my counter would always be that in terms of educational aspiration, look at some of the areas where Labour have been in control for years and years. I mean, where I grew up in Knowsley, I think it's the worst for education. I haven't seen the Labour Party do anything about that in the years that I've been involved in politics, or even beforehand. So it's all well and good the Labour Party talking about these things, but unless they actually improve people's lives, then I'm not entirely convinced by it. And the small opportunities that the Liberal Democrats have had, and I say this, as someone who looks admiringly at the Lib Dem ran council in Liverpool during the early 2000s, we massively improved education in the city, and we made the city a place to be proud of. And the Labour Party, it's kind of gone back to that whole like jobs for the boys, put self-interest first. And the Liberal Democrats have never been about that. And for me, politics is about like thinking of the person who's lowest on the rung and making sure that your actions ensure that they're going to be better off, regardless of what that means for you. And like that has always guided me. And I don't think it guides a lot of Labour politicians.
I come from a very Labour family, and like one of my aunties was like a union shop steward, and my mum was a union shop steward. But then also my mum became a boss, so that's I've got the influence about Labour and capital. And growing up, I was more attracted, not anymore, but to the Tories. Partly I realised that was whenever I thought of like Labour, at least in Liverpool, was that it always felt quite male and pale and stale, like this very like 1970s kind of like gruff, like macho kind of like bad comb overs of like these 70s like Labour
this is another
bosses.
Reason not to vote Labour as
well. And then I growing up, I would like have a lot of arguments with like my mum and my auntie and so everything like that. How did you find being in the areas where you grew up, having like that different view on politics than like your neighbours, your family, everything like that?
Yeah, I mean, like I had a very similar experience to you in that sense. So at first, my nan and granddad, who I grew up with, were kind of a bit taken aback and thought, don't really understand this. Maybe it's a bit of a phase, like going through an emo phase or something like that. And then I think as soon as they kind of realised that it was something that I really believed in, and they kind of looked into it themselves. They've never looked back, and without even thinking now, they'll go into every election and vote for the Liberal Democrats because they know what we stand for. And I remember when I first got involved in politics, my granddad's brother, all my granddad's family from Huyton, and him stopping me and saying like, oh, what are you doing? Like going with the traitors? Like we're all Labour around here. And I was like, it was a little bit of a struggle at first, but then something that always heartens me is that a lot of these people that vote Labour from like the likes of Huyton and other places, when you ask them why they do it, they can't actually tell you why they do it. And I remember this guy once, so obviously I used to represent Prescott before I now represent Churchward in Liverpool. And I remember in the first year that I got elected, knocking on this guy's door, and he was saying, like, oh, Carl, like, look, I love what you're doing. I think you're doing loads. But if I voted for you, my dad would turn in his grave. And this is like a really kind of persistent conversation that you tend to have with these types of Labour people, which I think is actually breaking down. That's another conversation, but I think is actually breaking down a little bit now. But then when it came to the next election, maybe it had given him a bit of time to kind of digest like just how much work that we did in the area. But I knocked on his door. He was saying, no, I can't be dealing with this Labour Party the way it is at the minute. Like I'm going to be voting for you. And that said to me that like that kind of attitude can be broken down, but it is like a really like, difficult, persistent attitude. And I think it just comes from kind of a generational folklore of, oh, we've just always done it that way. And, you know, the type of thinker that I am, I really don't kind of like that way of thinking. We've always done it this way because I quite like trying new and different things. And I think that has been difficult, but the more I've got into it, the more I've got confidence of telling people, well, look, you need to look at the reality of what's happened. Like, what's the Labour Party done in Liverpool and beyond? What have the Liberal Democrats done in Liverpool and beyond? When the Lib Dems tend to run something, they tend to run it well, not so much with the Labour Party.
I mean, you talked about how Nick Clegg in the 2010 election. What was it about politics that interested you?
I think coming from the background that I did, I'd always kind of had this, and you know, I had the fortune, I would say, of growing up with my nan and granddad and having a bit more of an old-fashioned way of thinking. But they always taught me what was right and wrong, and I always had this kind of strong moral compass of like, that's right, that, or that doesn't seem, that doesn't seem right. So I kind of always had that in me, and I would say for that reason I was always a Liberal. But I think just watching that debate and watching Nick Clegg and kind of feeling this kind of aspiration for change from him, that kind of swept me up. And then I think the thing that really got me interested in politics is that there's just so much wrong with society, sometimes like really easily fixable things as well. And I just thought, well, I'm going to get involved and do something about it.
Why become a politician as opposed to just being interested in politics or being an activist? Or
yeah, you're asking me this because you just said to me before this podcast, by the way, everyone, Aaron just said to me that he likes to stay in the shadows like a Peter Mandelson type. So I mean, I suppose I said this on ITV because I was on ITV last night, and they asked me kind of what I would say to young people wanting to get involved in politics. And I kind of said, you know, if you would have told an 18-year-old me that I was going to be a politician, I would have asked you what you were smoking. And I've never, ever had aspirations to be a politician. I just kind of fell into it in a really weird way. And I think the main way I fell into it was just through getting involved in elections and just loving elections. I would say first and foremost, before I'm anything, before I'm an administrator or like any sort of politician, I'm a campaigner. That's what I am first and foremost. And I love running campaigns and creating campaigns that make people's lives better. And it was that swept me up. And sometimes it feels like the politics is just kind of, it has to be done as well. And that's fine because obviously there needs to be an end product. But I feel like the campaigns is what gets people excited. And particularly in places like Liverpool, which is a really fiercely campaigning city.
So when I did an episode a few weeks ago ranking best US politics films, have you heard of a film called The Candidate?
Yeah, is it a comedy?
Kind of. Like,
Is it Will Ferrell?
No.
Oh no, I'm thinking of a different one.
So it's this 1973 film, and it's about Robert Redford is like this left-wing lawyer, and this like Machiavellian prefers the shadow as campaign manager approaches him and says to him, "Why don't you run for Senate in California against the sort of Republican guy who's been there for like decades, and you can say what you want because you're probably going to lose." And so he starts and he gets involved, and then he starts to get traction, and then the moral of the film is that basically in order to win, he's got to like soften his views and sort of, in his view, like be more centrist and sort of move his positions. And there's a scene at the end where his father is the former governor of California, and he doesn't have a good relationship with him. And his father's very much like an old school wheeler dealer politician. Robert Redford wins the election, and like literally one of the last scenes is his father comes in, congratulates him on winning, and he says, "Well, son, you're a politician now." And Robert Redford gives him a look that's like, it's a mixture of like anger and recognition.
Mm.
To me, that's very much a view of like politics as a bad thing.
Mm.
Whereas I get the impression from you, and it's also how I kind of see it, of like, there isn't necessarily that kind of betrayal in being a politician or campaigning. You can actually, it can be a positive thing in the things that you actually believe and enjoy it.
Yeah.
Like,
and it should, I think that's quite a good illustration of that, because I think that is right. And I think it doesn't have to be a negative thing, but I think my experience kind of looking at national politics and dealing with local and regional politics is that politicians are kind of seen as this, other, like they're not human. It's kind of like this higher standard, and people hold them to that higher standard as well. And I've never really understood that, because like in terms of like the British public, I think they're fairly understanding, and they've got a good idea of wrong and right. But when it comes to a politician, for some reason, like if they do something that a normal human being would do, it's kind of like, oh, that's outrageous. And I think the media plays a part in this, don't get me wrong. But I'm a big advocate for seeing politicians as human beings. And don't get me wrong, there are people, and we've seen this during COVID, that step way out of line and use their office for their own advantage, and they should be held to account completely. But when a politician does something that a normal human being would do, look, like there's two good examples of this. John Prescott, like when he punched that guy, and I think the people did actually at that time like think, right on him, like he should have done that. And I certainly take that view. But I think I don't really know too much about this, but the Labour politician recently that got in that scuffle, I think it was Widnes or something like that, Labour MP, and it's kind of like, they were recording him saying like, "Oh, you're an MP," and I thought, well, if someone else was in your face of a night, like most people would react in a very similar way. So I don't understand what him being an MP or a politician's got to do about that. And I think it's really perverse holding politicians to that standard, because then you end up getting like the fakery of politics, where it's a robot answering a question, and it's like, well, if you don't want that, like allow them to be human beings.
Yeah, I think a lot of people forget that like in the last 10 years, 2 MPs have been murdered and another one has been attempted murdered. And then there was also, I think, Rosie Cooper in Ormskirk, who was going to be the neo-Nazi plot.
Yeah.
So I do think like there's this thing of like politicians can take it and so I'll dish it out, but there's no real recognition of them as people, I guess.
Yeah. No, 100%. And I think social media's got a lot to do with that as well.
As I've said, I used to be a Tory, and I became more progressive. And because of that background, Something that annoys Labour friends of mine is when I say, in places like Liverpool, what is the functional difference between Labour and the Lib Dems? Coming from my background on the centre right, what is different between the two parties?
I would say the main difference for me is a fundamental trust of people. And I think the Labour, and I think you'll see this in government now, they'll make some really good reforms because, Social Democrats and Liberals tend to make very good reforms and know how to change things, but they will do it in a very overbearing nanny state way. And I think that's been the Labour Party in Liverpool. Whereas the Liberal Democrats, like, our fundamental belief is in the individual. So we trust people to know what is best to do in their lives and also the best way to run their communities. That for me is a massive, so it might seem small, but it's a massive difference, because people, when you give them the power, like, can do absolutely amazing things, particularly in Liverpool, which is an extremely entrepreneurial city. I would say people are so creative in Liverpool. And an example of, like, where this has happened is when we ran the council. So we had a thing called, I think it was Liverpool Vision. And it was essentially, we set these business people free and said, what needs to happen in Liverpool for business in order for us to grow? And even if that's critical of the council, you go away and do that work. When Labour came to power, Joe Anderson came to power, he ended up making himself chair of that. And then he ended up disbanding it when he thought that it wasn't doing anything to help the city. Well, of course, it's not, because it's being led by a politician. And sometimes you need to trust businesses, you need to trust small enterprises, you need to trust people in order to properly power the city. There's so many people in the city that know so much more than politicians. And so what might seem like a very small difference in trusting people is actually a massively significant difference.
Let's say you became leader of the council in 2027.
Yeah.
How would your administration be different from the one now?
I think it would be different one of the first things I want to do is set up, it might not look exactly the same as Liverpool Vision, but set up something that gives autonomy to businesses in the city to drive growth forward. I mean, we've got a council at the moment that has got the administration right, or is getting the administration right, which is a very low bar. When you're working from the ground and you've made 10% progress, it looks like a lot, but what is Liverpool's vision? What does Liverpool stand for? And I don't think any Labour politician could answer that for you. And I think that you've got unimaginative politicians, and I would count Steve Rotherham in that, even though I quite like Steve as a person. But I think when it comes to imagining what Liverpool stands for and going and selling Liverpool abroad, I don't know what he'd actually be saying. I know what I'd be saying. Liverpool is a destination city. It's a place that people should be coming to host their events. It should be a place that people are coming, because at the end of the line, in terms of the railway, what are we offering people to make sure that they come here and stay here? That needs a big strategic overhaul. Not happening, in my view, at the moment. That is one of the first things that I would be working on.
We spoke back in the summer, our last failed attempt, which was shortly after the election, and the Liberal Democrats got the best result in 100 years. And we were sort of talking about the possibility of the Liberal Democrats becoming the official opposition, which seems to be like Ed Davey's strategic goal. But when we spoke, there was like a lot of known unknowns. So like the budget hadn't been done yet. We didn't know who the leader of the Tories was going to be and what direction they'd take them. How do you see things now compared to August?
Yeah, probably maybe slightly differently, but broadly similar. So I think Badenoch's election as Tory leader presents us with a massive opportunity, because it's quite clear that the Tories, rather than kind of coming back to that sensible middle ground, have actually said, we're going to lurch to the right because we think it's more important to fight the likes of reform for that space in politics than to fight for that centre ground. And I think any political party that's done that over time has ended up suffering, and long may that suffering continue for the Tories, to be honest. So it does present a massive opportunity for us across the country. And look, if you look at a political map of the UK, every area that where the next 20 seats where we're second and got an opportunity is behind the Tories. So I get the party's strategy, and it could well lead us to having slightly more seats than the Tories and taking that advantage. That would be absolutely massive and a big game changer in UK politics. But obviously, kind of being a Labour facing lad and coming out to bat for like my Labour facing LibDems as well, I have to make that case to the party that we shouldn't forget that Labour are the people that we're also fighting. And I had an interesting conversation with a Labour MP yesterday who said, "Oh, it's quite nice, like looking across the chamber and seeing like you guys having a go at the Tories and we're having a go at the Tories, and why that might be like a really nice loving in Parliament." And I like it myself as well, because I think the Tories deserve it. I also think we need to be careful of being like too cosy, because the Labour Party have got a lot of tendencies to be, like I said before, overbearing. I mean, some of the decisions that Keir Starmer's taking at the moment, I just can't wrap my head around why he's done that and done it so quickly. And there will be opportunities around the rest of the country where we're in third and fourth place, where I genuinely think that we can beat the Labour Party, and we shouldn't just be the Tory party, the alternative to the Tory party, or Tory light. That is not what the Liberal Democrats are. The Liberal Democrats are a progressive, moderate party that represents like the wide range of views that are in this city and in this country. And in order to do that, we also need to be fighting the Labour Party as well.
This is why I'm quite interested in this question of like, what's the difference between Labour and the Lib Dems? Because let's say the Lib Dems do overtake the Tories as the other party government. Basically, Ed Davey would have to do what you're kind of doing, which is like having a Lib Dem critique of Labour. So that's why I'm quite interested of like, what is fundamentally the difference to offer people two opposing options?
Well, I think like nationally speaking, I would say it's the same thing. It's like trusting people. But then I would also say, I mean, I don't mean to sound kind of cheeky in saying this, but I feel like it's progressive policies that are more well thought through. So I feel like the Labour Party tend to kind of think, oh, isn't this like really nice and shiny? It'd be a good idea. Put it into place and then don't do any consultation or further deep diving about it. Whereas the Liberal Democrats tend to do that, because by nature we're full of geeks, policy geeks as well. I mean, there's an old joke that in order to make a decision in the Liberal Democrats, that it needs to go through 10 committees and then be subsequently agreed by one last committee before it goes through. And I think, in some ways that can hold things up, but then it means that you're going to get really, really detailed, good, thought through policy. And an example of that is the recent winter fuel payments cut by Labour. Like, some pensioners that will be affected by that will be on just over £210 a week. That's less than £12,000 a year. Those aren't wealthy pensioners. So rather than just us turn around and say, isn't this awful, like the Tories have done, because the Tories tend to just be able to do that because they don't really think things through either. Rather than just do that, we've said, actually, why don't you pause, have a think about it, and let's have a threshold in place for this that is realistic and will help people. So it's got to be much higher than that, 210 a week. But how much higher? That's the time. You've got this time now in government to think about what that should look like. It needs to be much higher, but like, have it. That's what the committees are there for in Parliament. Work it through. Whereas the Labour Party have just come straight in and said, "Here you go, guys. That's what you have, and deal with it." And I think a lot of pensioners are going to be upset with them for that.
I mean, the politics of the winter fuel allowance has driven me crazy ever since it was announced. A few months ago, I interviewed Damian Collins, former Tory MP, who's just written a book about David Lloyd George, and I put to him the just as in Lloyd George day, you had this realignment where Labour overtook the Liberals, whether something similar was going to happen now and the Lib Dems overtake the Tories. And his response was basically, there are centre-left solutions to policy problems as represented by Labour. There are centre-right solutions to those problems as represented by the Tories. But there's nothing distinctly liberal or Lib Dem. So his argument was there's no distinctly Lib Dem solution to the NHS or housing or anything like that. There's a centre right and there's a centre left, and there's two parties representing them, and so the Lib Dems are stuck between those two things.
I mean, it's a good point to put, but I don't necessarily agree with that, because I remember when I first got involved in politics, and like my ex girlfriend, going way back, like, she said to me, like, why have you joined the Lib Dems? And I was like, well, everything that I'm reading is something I agree with, but isn't it just the best of Labour and the best of the Tories taken and putting together? And I was like, isn't that a good thing? And I think kind of that centre ground where, you're not afraid to kind of be like low tax, but also, in some regards, tax and spend when you need to be, is actually like a good solution. So I would say that there is a distinctive Liberal solution to these problems. And, our manifesto at the last general election was a manifesto for the NHS. So, something that distinguishes us from Labour, definitely from the Tories, is that we've said that you need to fix social care to fix the NHS. It's crazy that you've just had a budget that did not mention social care. It's absolutely insane. That is one of the biggest strains on councils, one of the biggest strains on the NHS. So I feel like we've been really distinctive on that. And, in terms of taking certain positions on things and policy solutions, something that I don't fully agree with my party at the moment is the position on farmers' inheritance tax. But I can see part of the argument. So I know that the Tories are going to have a pile on with this because they're being politically opportunistic with it. But I think that we're making a strong case for some of these tenanted farmers that some people might see as a kind of a low tax centre right case for farmers. Actually, I just see it as a really liberal case, as let's be sensible. These people produce our food. When they're passing their land on, passing it on to the sons or daughters who are going to be farmers as well. So actually, there's no wealth within that farm. It is just the asset of the farm. And I think that is quite distinctly liberal, without being like centre right and saying, oh, no tax, or without being centre left and saying, let's tax them as much as we possibly can because these are all wealthy landowners when they're not. I think that's quite distinctive, in the same way that we were distinctive on the NHS and social care.
I mean, I do feel I listened to earlier this year Ed Davey being interviewed by Alistair Campbell and Roy Stewart, and they kept pressing him on explaining who the Lib Dems are for. And it's like, the Tories are for someone, Labour's for someone, the Lib Dems are for everyone, and therefore for no one. But I do feel that all the parties represent diverse coalitions.
Yeah.
And they all have to give different messages to different bits in that coalition. It just seems like the Lib Dems, there's more focus on them to explain the contradictions in their coalition as opposed to the Labour coalition or the Tory coalition.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I mean, it wouldn't be a podcast with a Lib Dem on it if I didn't mention about proportional representation. And I think that would be the key to allowing or to knowing what political party really stood up for what individual and an array of individuals, because rather than have those kinds of three different wings of the Labour Party or two different wings of the Tory Party and two different wings of the Liberal Democrats, you would probably have 6 or 7 different parties that people, like Jeremy Corbyn would fit into a very left-wing socialist party. Keir Starmer might fit into a social democratic party. and Badenoch would be probably with Farage somewhere, but that really for me, and something I've believed my whole political life, would allow the UK to have a real choice in what people actually wanted, and you wouldn't be going into it with this whole argument of I've got to vote tactically. I really want the Lib Dems, but I know that it's only Labour against the Tories that have got a choice here, and that would eradicate all that, and people could actually think, well, you know what, Lib Dems speak for me because they believe in legalising same-sex marriage or legalising marijuana. I've just given two really woke examples then, haven't I? It's going to be called a snowflake at the end of this, but it would allow people to have a real choice, and it would then stop all this, who does this person represent, I think.
What would you say to the argument that basically the Lib Dems seem to have figured out first past the post? So is it in their interest to keep it and then build out that base?
Yeah, I that is, I can't really argue with that, because I think, didn't we get the exact same amount of seats as percentage that we should have got because of the votes that we got? I think we got say 13% of the votes and ended up with almost 13% of the seats. So you're probably right in that sense. And I think that is, as a party, us working really tactically to do that. I mean, but look, let's not beat around the bush about the people that benefit the most from first past the post are the two big parties. And they know that. When the Labour parties had the opportunity to change that, they haven't taken it. So, forgive me if I'm not too optimistic about the Labour Party being massive reformers, because quite often they like the status quo. But we have figured out first past the post in that way, and I think people are much more happy to use the tactical voting that comes along with that when they can see what's going to happen. I think when elections become really close, that's when people kind of get pulled both ways, and you do end up with parties like the Liberal Democrats or others getting really squeezed because it becomes a binary choice.
I mean, I did see something about how if the Tories continue to, basically if British politics is effectively split between Labour, Lib Dems, Tories, Reform, and then the Tories are on the receiving end of this tactical voting, they might be amenable to a proportional representation in order to try and claw back any kind of representation.
Yeah. I think this the biggest compliment I will give to the Tories is that they are ruthless when it comes to wanting power and being able to get in that position where they can exercise power. And that is probably the best thing I can say about them, because they've done that ever since their inception. And I think the Labour Party are notoriously bad at that. And, the Liberal Democrats, maybe to a certain extent, but when it we can be very ruthless when it comes to kinds of concentrating on what we need to concentrate on. Reform are kind of the oddball in that for me, because I would agree with you if Reform were only a threat, or I thought Reform were only a threat to the Tories, but I don't think that's the case. And the Labour Party really need to heed this warning. I think Reform are almost as much of a threat to the Labour Party as they are to the Tories, because some of those people that will vote for the Labour Party are conservative with a small c without realising it. Those types we were talking about before, that I've been Labour my whole life, quite a lot of them have quite right-wing views, and I think get fed up with the status quo, and the Reform seems like a way of kind of hitting back at that at the moment.
I mean, something that really interests me about British politics right now, and it kind of touches on what we've been talking about. My last episode, I was interviewing a Finnish international relations scholar about his book, Pax Transatlantica, which is about some transatlantic space after the Cold War and stuff. And he sort of made the point that the end of the Cold War removed ideological certainty. There was a left and there was a right. And ever since the end of the Cold War, everyone's been trying to find new answers to stuff, but still using old language. And so you find a situation in British politics right now where people will say, I'm economically conservative, but I'm socially liberal. But there's no one word to describe both those positions. Whereas in the past, you would be right wing or you'd be left wing. There was no, and now it's like, as you kind of said, there'll be small c conservative people who historically have identified as Labour, but now as something else. But there's no word to say what their views are.
Yeah, that's a really really good point actually, because you can't really ban those people into one category, because like, you know, in the past you would have just called them those stalwart Labour voters, but now it's not quite clear what they are or who they vote for anymore. And actually in 2019, a lot of them voted for Boris Johnson. I mean, I know what I would call like economically liberal and socially liberal people. I'd call them liberals. And I think so. I always have taken that view that like social progress, but along with like economic literacy, is like an extremely like liberal idea. And you know, I've always espoused that, because in my personal life I see like how much like economic liberalism, and I know that this has kind of been hijacked in some way by like Thatcher, and I kind of feel like I need to spit like that word out of my mouth when I say it. But I suppose the way capital can benefit people from poorer backgrounds, and I believe that through being a mortgage broker. Like, you know, someone who never would have thought that they could have owned their own home, that they'll pay less money on and be able to leave as a legacy for their kids, like helping them to do that and using the power of like a high street lender or a bank to do that, like, is massively liberating. Like, how amazing is it that you can like give someone like their own home through that? So it's so powerful. Like, and this kind of like pushback against globalism, like you'd usually kind of see that as a weirdly like right wing thing that would, you know, the globalists, they just want us all to be the same. But actually, I feel like the left are playing into that a little bit as well, in some sense. And like, you know, saying that people are trying to take over like whole nations. And I'm just kind of like a little bit sorry at the state of politics at the moment and how it's got to this point.
I mean, that kind of speaks to my next question, which is, I would say, as I said, people are always to the LibDems being like contradictory. Give us a ideologically and policy coherent position. And I feel like on Trump, the LibDems have the most ideologically and policy coherent position than either the Tories or Labour, in the sense of Ed Davey's question at PMQs the other week.
Yeah.
Basically laying out an ideological opposition to Trump, what that means in terms of, say, policy on Ukraine, but also if Trump's going to introduce tariffs, that justifies closer alignment with the EU, and then eventual sort of maybe single market membership or anything like that. Whereas both Labour and the Tories have a hodgepodge of positions that they can't quite justify.
Yeah. I mean, I would call that common sense. And like I honestly describe myself as a common sense liberal, because like, isn't it common sense that if an American president is going to put tariffs on Britain, that you would actually have closer allegiances to the next biggest trading bloc next to you? It's not for me anyway. It's not ideological. It's just common sense. And I think a lot of the time, like, we can take that common sense position. And I understand, you know, Labour's position on it is they're in government. They're going to have to work with whoever's president of the United States, whether it was Trump or someone else. So I get that. But then I also think it's just really straightforward that we should have closer ties with Europe. And I do not understand this kind of reluctance to do it because of Brexit, or having any closer relations with Europe would mean that we're going back on Brexit. No, it doesn't. Like, we do trade with the world. Europe happens to be our closest trade partner, with access to like hundreds of markets, because there's plenty of countries there that want to trade with us. And it was interesting the other day. I had this kind of take it off on a little bit of a tangent, but relevant. I had this conversation with someone who's an economist in Liverpool, and she was saying to me, much of the customs regulations that Britain has to adhere to with the European Union, what will happen is these companies in Britain will already change their rules to adhere to the customs that the European Union wants, because they don't want no trade barrier. So essentially, we're in a customs union with the European Union without knowing it, and it would just save a whole load of, I'm just going to say it, save a whole load of crap, like just to enter into the customs union, enter into the single market, and stop all this nonsense that like puts up barriers to trade.
I mean, something that does frustrate me with the Starmer government is that a lot of things it does it justifies in a very negative way. So, like the inheritance tax is on farms is a good one, in the sense of the most common rebuttal to criticisms is, well, if farmers just pass it on several years before they think they're going to die, those family won't pay the inheritance tax.
Mm.
So they're justifying something they're doing by saying you can get out of it if you just do this. Yeah. So why are you worrying? And there was something else. It was like that with winter fuel allowance as well.
Yeah,
it was
pensions going up.
Basically, if you apply for pensions credit, you won't have to worry about winter fuel allowance.
Yeah.
And then someone pointed out that the cost of everyone who's eligible for pension credit applying for it exceeded the money saved from the winter fuel allowance. And I think that's something similar with Europe. It's like the justifications are often negative, and usually it's a case of like there's some loophole, so you don't have to criticize us about this because there's a loophole that gets us and you out of it anyway.
Yeah.
So that is something that frustrates me. But there's often no positive case for things. It's often a negative case for things.
Well, he started that off, hasn't he, by coming in and just saying, by the way, it's going to get worse. And I don't know who they've got to do their marketing, but whoever's doing it should be sacked, because like there is. I mean, look at when New Labour came to power. That was just a completely different feel, and I know things are different, but I believe there's a way to have marketed what they've done in a much better way, and just not actually take some of the decisions they've taken full stop, because it's just the political capital that they've lost for it. For, like you say, something that's actually not going to save them a lot of money has just seemed ludicrous.
I mean, I did see it, again, the master. Tony Blair said, I think he was asked about how depressive Starmer was being at the beginning. And I think he said, like, no one wants to get on a plane with a depressed pilot. Like,
no, I like that. And I mean, what I always old video. I don't want to sound like a Blair fanboy, but like old videos of Blair have been emerging on some of my social media, and just the way that he dealt with people when they'd ask him tough questions when he was Prime Minister, it's such a far cry from the way that people deal with it now. Even the latest Tory Prime Ministers as well, Blair just seemed to tackle people head on. And I think people actually respect that. I think they would respect Starmer more if he just said, look, this is the situation. This is what I need to do. But I promise you that once I've done it, like, I'm going to be able to deliver this, and this. Doesn't seem like he's got that right yet.
I mean, have you seen Tony Blair's takedown of Nigel Farage?
Oh, in the European Parliament? Yeah, one of the best things ever.
We kind of touched on this last time we spoke. Stephen Bush, the Financial Times columnist, he wrote an article back in just after the election, sort of saying that there are like three pillars to any LibDem strategy. One is what Labour are going to do, which at the time was unknown because the budget hadn't come out. The second pillar was what the Tories are going to do, but we didn't know who was going to be leader. And the third one was every 10 years or so, a government is rehabilitated in people's eyes. And people maybe at the time thought it was a terrible government. And then as time's gone on, they've sort of re-evaluated it and stuff like that. Like the major years have seemed much more positive than they were at the time. So Stephen Bush was arguing that the Lib Dems need to rehabilitate the coalition and argue about why the coalition was good, and therefore if the Lib Dems get back into government, it'll be good again. What, in your view, would you rehabilitate about the coalition?
I mean, well, first of all, I think that's probably right to a degree, because I think we kind of seen that during this last general election, didn't we, with the new Labour government, and just people looking back on that with kind of rose-tinted glasses. So I think that might be right. I think in terms of the coalition, there was a lot of things that I wasn't comfortable with, and that's because of the type of politics that I espouse. But I mean, some of the things that we did, I mean, same-sex marriage is one of the things I'm most proudest of that we did in government. The pupil premium, making sure that like pupils from poorer backgrounds got more money. The personal tax threshold, that was like something, you know, there's people paying thousands of pounds less in tax now because we did that. There was a whole host of things that we should have been really, really proud of. There was a whole host of things that we were really stupid on as well, and I'm more than happy to kind of to mention that also. But I do think that there's something to telling people that when the Lib Dems run things, we run it with the forethought of people, you know, in our minds, and we did that, I think, in government, and you know, at times trying to get something right, but not kind of getting the marketing or the actual way that we described it right. I can kind of forgive that for a little bit, for trying to do the right thing for people. But also, like in local authorities around the country, I think, you know, 3 of the top 5, don't quote me on this, but I think it's 3 of the top 5 councils for recycling are all Lib Dem councils. When we run things, we run them well, and that's one of the things that I'm quite keen to say in Liverpool, not so much about the coalition, but about when we ran the council, we did run it well. And I would hope that kind of, that thing that you've just mentioned then about people looking back on administrations will apply locally as well as nationally.
My last question would be, what have you learned from 2024? What lessons have you drawn from this year?
To give people the benefit of the doubt. That's what I would say in leadership. You can't hold people to the same like level as you, and like sometimes you've kind of got to forgive people for the either not delivering on something or not having the capacity to deliver on something. So I'd say that's been the biggest thing I've learned, probably about myself. And then in politics, it's just that, you know, people probably don't listen to past the first 20 seconds like of what you're saying, so you need to make sure that you get like what you're saying in there quick. And I think that's become more apparent with the likes of the rise of Trump over the last few years.
I mean, they say to err is human, but I'll say that again. They do say that to err I might keep all this in. They say to err is human, to forgive divine.
I like that. I mean, I didn't know you were a godly man.
Carl, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I want to thank Carl again for sparing the time. If you enjoyed our conversation, please rate, like, comment, etc., etc., etc. If you want to buy any of the books mentioned on the show, or any of those by guests, and support independent stores in the UK, check out my bookshop page in the show notes. See you all next time.